Lord, the light of your love is shining in the midst of the darkness shining. Jesus, light of the world, shine upon us. Set us free by the truth you now bring us. Shine on me. Shine on me. Shine, Jesus, shine. Fill this land with the Father's glory. Blaze, Spirit, blaze. Set our hearts on fire. Flow, river, flow. Flood the nations with grace and mercy. Send forth your word, Lord, and let there be light.
Good morning and welcome to Let the Bible Speak. My name is Alex Meredith. Really glad you're here. Glad you have joined us this morning. We are continuing our series called The Crown. We have been talking about the early years of the Israelite monarchy, really digging into and looking at the lives of both Saul and David, the first two kings of the nation of Israel. So far, we have talked about Saul's appointment as the first king, and sort of the hesitancy on Samuel's side that went into that. We've talked about some of Saul's mistakes, and then the subsequent anointing of David, anointed as the next king of Israel. Now, David has been anointed the next king of Israel. However, we are yet to see any sort of public recognition, really, of that anointing. And really, David as a public figure at this point is relatively unknown, so there's not that public prestige established at this point to really even make that transition. David, by dynasty, has no rights to the throne at this point. So what we're going to see is a series of events over the next little while that are going to increase his public presence, you might say. And that's what we see here. I actually want to start by telling you about the 1988 Jamaican bobsled team. If you've ever seen the movie Cool Runnings, it's actually about the 1988 Jamaican bobsled team. On its face, Jamaican bobsled team sounds like a bit of a paradox. Why would that exist? And it was really incredible. It all started when a couple of American men, George Fitch and William Maloney, they were a couple of Americans down in Jamaica who had seen a local pushcart race, and they had this crazy idea that they brought before the Jamaican Olympic Committee to get some funding for a Jamaican bobsled team. And remarkably, they said yes. They agreed to it. And since they had no bobsledders there in Jamaica, understandably, they went to the Jamaican Army to look for athletes as potential candidates for this team. And sure enough, they found four candidates: Devin Harris, Michael White, Dudley Stokes, and Chris Stokes, who knew absolutely nothing about bobsledding. In fact, Dudley, at a later point, was interviewed about this whole thing, and he said something along the lines of the fact that he had only seen the sport for about 20 seconds. That's all the experience he had about it. And they agreed to do this crazy, wild thing. And so they went to Calgary, Alberta, and in the qualifying rounds, they remarkably qualified. This got all kinds of media coverage and attention. People were just loving the fact that the Jamaican bobsled team made it to the Olympics. And so they competed in the Olympic Games. After a crash in the four-man event, they were actually disqualified from the four-man, but then they entered the two-man event, and they finished 30th out of 41 positions. And of course, it's 30th, but it's 30th for a Jamaican bobsled team. A few years later, in 1994, in the Olympics in Norway, they got 14th place. That's right. They got 14th place, beating out the United States and Russia and France, by the way, as well. The world loved it. They just ate it up. Why? Because everybody loves an underdog. The idea of a Jamaican bobsled team just seemed so impossible. Why wouldn't you root for them, right? Everybody loves an underdog story. That's why there are still Lions fans out there. I'm sorry, I had to. But today we're going to be talking about the original underdog story. We're going to be talking about David and Goliath. David and Goliath, by the way, there's a roller coaster in Atlanta at one of the theme parks called Goliath. It's gigantic. That's not really too related to what we're talking about today, but I thought I'd mention it. Because Goliath, of course, is a monster. He's huge. He's this big seasoned warrior going up against David, the young shepherd boy. So today we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. We are going to sort of look at some bits and pieces of the whole chapter. I'll let you know where we are along the way as we move from place to place. But we're going to start with verses 1 through 11. A little bit of context here. David at this point is now, after he had been anointed as the upcoming king of Israel, he is now in Saul's service. He is actually a servant of Saul, doing a number of different things. Saul also does not know that David's been anointed. And that's a big part of the formula here. And that's why, as of yet, there is not a tremendous amount of enmity. So they are also at war with a nation called Philistia. They're on the western coast by the Mediterranean Sea. Israel is at war with Philistia, and this is where we're at in 1 Samuel 17. So let's read verses 1 through 11. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered, and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armored with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield-bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So Israel is in some really real danger here, right? They've got to beat Goliath if they are to have any chance at victory, to avoid defeat, to avoid enslavement. But here's the thing, nobody has the courage. You saw at the very end of that section in verse 11, it said, Israel was greatly afraid. And if you think about it, Goliath was pretty terrifying, wasn't he? According to the Masoretic text and the way that it conveys his height, if you do the conversions, the Masoretic text puts him somewhere around 9 feet tall. The Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts put him more around 6 feet, which even that would have been really tall in the ancient world. I'm not really sure exactly what his height was, but the point is that it's trying to convey he was massive, right? And not only was he massive, but he had this fortified bronze armor on his chest and on his legs. On his chest, he was wearing this chainmail, which just the chainmail alone would have weighed about 125 pounds, according to the measurements it gives. He had a bronze javelin with an iron spearhead, and the spearhead itself weighed about 15 pounds. He had a shield bearer going before him with this large shield. I mean, all of this is intended to show the ridiculousness, the absolute absurdity of David's upcoming suggestion. Okay, so this text also, meanwhile, is sort of inviting us to think about our own Goliath, right? Those situations, those people, those those moments in life that just paralyze us with fear. There's something very relatable about that, right? So let's go to this next section, and I'm actually going to start in verse 24 through 27. So this is 1 Samuel 17, 24 through 27. Listen to this. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel." And David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And the people answered him in the same way, "So shall it be done to the man who kills him." You notice Israel's response compared to David's, right? In verse 24, it says, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. Meanwhile, you have David here coming up and he's saying, who is this uncircumcised Philistine, this foreigner who's mocking our God? You notice a huge contrast, right? The huge contrast in the way that they approach the situation. And you almost wonder, why is David so confident? And is it confidence or is it arrogance, right? Well, let's keep reading, starting in verse 31, 1 Samuel 17:31. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul and sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Saul is understandably resistant. This is his servant. This is a man of Israel. He doesn't want to lose him senselessly. Of course, in hindsight, if a ways down the line, if Saul could have looked back on this moment, he would have sent him instantly with no hesitation. But at the time, Saul's very hesitant about all of this. He doesn't see the sense in it. And it's almost as if when you're reading this, you're supposed to see the absurdity of it too. You're supposed to look at this gigantic man with all of this, these tools of war, who's been, war seasoned. He's battle tested, and then you look at David, and you're supposed to think, "There's no way this should happen. You shouldn't do this. No, this is a bad idea." And Saul is expressing his concern from that standpoint. Meanwhile, David is confident. Right? And what we discover about David's confidence here, for one thing, we discover it is confidence. It's not arrogance. But it's not confidence in his own skill. See, in this section, he actually recalls the past. He thinks about his past experiences, which, by the way, our past experiences inform our expectations of the future, right? Our past experiences inform our expectations of the future. And that's absolutely true with David here. He says, look, I've fought lions and bears. And what does he say about those experiences? At first, he says something along the lines of, "And I caught him, and I killed him. And just like I killed him, I can do the same thing to Goliath." But then what does he say eventually in verse 37? "The Lord who delivered me out of the hand of the lions and the bears." See, he recognized that while it was David that had actually done those things physically, God was the one who was behind him, helping him do it and giving him the strength to do it. God was the actor behind all of it, right? And that's exactly why he's confident here. He's not confident because he believes he's stronger than Goliath. He's not confident because he believes that he is more skillful than Goliath. He's confident because he has trust in the living God who is behind his people and behind him, just like he's been behind him his entire life, right? So his past experiences informed his expectations of the future in a very clear and defined way. And there's a really important message here about godly leadership. When we talk about facing an enemy or facing an obstacle that we are not strong enough to overcome, consider this. When you think about all the different great leaders of the world, they're ambitious, right? And they always believe that there are no limits, there's no feat they cannot achieve, no obstacle they cannot overcome. And inevitably, they are beaten by an enemy that is stronger, that is smarter. Meanwhile, the great leaders of the faith recognize that against the obstacles before them, they are totally and utterly weak and powerless. And so they call on the only one who's able to overcome all those things. They call on God. And so, good leadership, it's not measured by physical prowess or by social influence. Good leadership is measured by faith, right? That's exactly what David demonstrates here in this really remarkable and iconic passage. So let's keep reading, starting in verse 41. Well, we're going to read through verse 51, and we're going to see how all of this pans out. So again, 1 Samuel 17:41. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the fields." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord," notice he doesn't say I, he says, "the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with a sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Wow. So the underdog wins. And if you think about this whole scene of combat, it's really remarkable. You have this javelin-wielding juggernaut against a shepherd boy, right? He doesn't even have a sword on him. All he has is a sling, which it's not so much as what you would think of as a slingshot as it would be a piece of cloth that he would have swung around like that, and then you put something heavy in the end of it like a stone or a rock, and then you fling it like that. And it was normally used by shepherds to keep away wolves and the like, right? That's what he used against Goliath. And all it took, he had put 5 stones in his bag, and all it took was the fling of one stone hit Goliath in the head, and that's it. And once again, you're supposed to look at this and go, that shouldn't have happened. You're supposed to look at this and go, there's no way. And that's exactly the point, right? That is exactly the point. Because when you look at this impossible kind of outcome, it's intended to demonstrate God's activity. You're supposed to look at it and go, there is no way that should have been possible, so the only way it was possible is by divine intervention. It's by the fact that God was behind David, right? There's no way this could have happened without God. I think about Luke 1:37 that says nothing will be impossible with God. So David faced his Goliath, literally. And he was certain that God would take care of him. That is what I think is really the epitome of faith over fear, right? Having faith rather than being afraid. I suspect God likes underdog stories as well, for two reasons. One reason is the fact that underdog stories are extremely common in the Bible. You think about all of the people that God picked, right, to participate in his salvific mission. You think about David, just a young shepherd, Moses, the killer, who didn't even have confidence in himself, Gideon, who God calls a man of valor, but Gideon describes himself as the weakest man from the weakest family, from the weakest clan in Israel. You think about Mary, right, just a poor young unmarried girl with otherwise no remarkable status or anything. Peter himself, the denier, the fisherman from Galilee, Paul, who was formerly Saul, the persecutor, right? All of these people, they're underdogs, right? And a lot of times, and this gets into our second reason of why I think God bothers with that in the first place, is the fact that it's only through people's weakness that God's glory shines. If you think about the story of David and Goliath again, how would it have been if back in 1 Samuel chapter 16, remember Samuel went to the house of Jesse, and he immediately, Eliab caught his attention immediately, right? I don't know what it was about Eliab that caught his attention. I would assume it was something to do with the way that he looked, based on how that interaction went, right? Maybe he was really strong, maybe he was really big, really charismatic, right? The way we typically think about good leaders, or even a military leader, a warrior. And we later find out that Eliab and David's other brothers, they are warriors on the battlefield, while David isn't even on the front lines. So how would it have gone if Eliab, not Goliath, but still a capable warrior, how would it have gone if Eliab came up with a sword, with armor? There was kind of a more or less a fair fight, and then Eliab won. Well, it still would have been remarkable, but don't you think that God's activity would have been a little less apparent? I think God would almost get forgotten in a situation like that. I think about 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, right, where it says, "My power is made perfect in weakness." My power is made perfect in weakness. Now, there's a real temptation to sort of sensationalize this story a bit. You can make it spiritually shallow, I would say. If David can beat Goliath, then you can fill in the blank. If David can beat Goliath, then you can get that job, you can get that house, you can, all these things that are very self-gain, personally advantageous. That's the way I would put it. And that's not really the point here. In a way, that phrasing almost removes God from the equation, because then it becomes all about your skill, right? A better way to put it would be to say that if God can give David the victory over Goliath, what can he do through you? If God can give David the victory over Goliath, what can he do through you? Because we have Goliaths in our lives, don't we? Those things, those seemingly insurmountable obstacles that just terrify us. For myself, I think the biggest challenge in my life personally at the moment is being a father. It's incredibly difficult. It's incredibly scary. And there are times over and over where I think, I don't think I did that right. I don't know what to do, right? And I can't do that by myself. I need the help not only of my wife, I need the help of God. I need God's presence. I need God's guidance in that effort. I couldn't do it without that. David, he couldn't have done it on his own. Very powerful passage in Psalm 124. I want to read this to you. Psalm 124, listen to this. David couldn't have done it without God. If it had not been the Lord who was on our side. Let Israel now say, if it had not been the Lord who was on our side, when people rose up against us, they would have swallowed us up alive. When their anger was kindled against us, then the flood would have swept us away, the torrent would have gone over us. Then over us would have gone the raging waters. Blessed be the Lord, who has not given us as prey to their teeth. We have escaped like a bird from the snare of the fowlers. The snare is broken, and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. That sounds remarkably like David. So, I'm going to tell you something that you may not hear very often. Because the truth is, some of you may be scared to death right now at the challenges that are ahead. And I'm going to tell you something that's maybe a little hard to hear even. You are weak, and you are powerless. And so am I, and so is everybody else around you. And that's not a bad thing. Because while we are weak, God is strong. God is stronger than the obstacles that you face. He is stronger than you. He is stronger than your weakness. And if you trust not in yourself, but if you trust in God and His power, He will give you the victory, right? If we could do it all ourselves, all of the world's problems would have been solved by now, don't you think? And we look at these insurmountable obstacles, things like sin and death, evil in the world. Well, what do we do about that? We can't do anything except control its presence in our own lives, even then to some degree, right? We need God. Moreover, we need Jesus. We need the hope of His return. We need His cleansing power in our own life to deal with the sin that's already on us. We also need the hope of His return for an expectation of a world without it. God will give us the victory. One last passage I want to read to you. This is in Joshua chapter 1, verse 9. This is when Joshua is about to he has begun to enter the promised land, about to take over Jericho, the first city there. There we go, if I can find it. Joshua chapter 1, verse 9. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous, do not be frightened, do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. The solution to these obstacles that terrify us and scare us to death, the solution is not fear. The solution is faith. And that is what I call faith over fear. I hope you've been encouraged and challenged by the message today. May God bless you in all that you do. I want to thank you for joining us. Be sure to join us next week here on Sunday at 10 a.m. on Let the Bible Speak.